Hi everyone. Detective Lefebre speaks. It started like so many of my cases, with an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was shaky but determined. This is Nurse Amanda Rivers. I need help. Patients are dying under Dr. Alec Donovan's care, and it's not natural. The skepticism in my tone must have been evident. Hospitals lose patients, Miss Rivers. It's tragic, but not like this, she cut in sharply. There's something wrong. He's controlling it, the way they go. Her words struck a chord. In my line of work, you learn to read between the lines, and this wasn't just paranoia. There was fear in her voice, but also conviction. Meet me at Java and Company tomorrow at 8 a.m. We'll talk more then, I said, jotting down her name. The next morning, I found her huddled in a corner of the cafe, nursing a black coffee with trembling hands. Amanda looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. It's not just bad luck, she insisted. Dr. Donovan, he's picking people. They come in for something small, and then they don't leave. I decided it was worth a closer look. Cases like this required treading lightly. You didn't accuse a doctor of murder without evidence. But Amanda's desperation made it hard to walk away. The hospital loomed large and impersonal as I approached. Inside, the corridors were a hive of activity. Nurses hustling with charts, doctors speaking in clipped tones, patients shuffled between procedures. Everything seemed normal at first glance, which made Amanda's claims all the more chilling. Amanda had prepared a list of names, patients who had died under suspicious circumstances in the past 6 months. There, she pointed to her room. That's where Mrs. Lang passed away. She was recovering from surgery. Stable. Then, overnight gone. My gut told me that this was no ordinary hospital tragedy. The patterns in Amanda's list showed something peculiar. All the deaths occurred during late-night shifts, all under Dr. Donovan's care. I can't accuse him without proof, she said, but I know what I see. He's always there when they die. Too calm, too calculated. It was subtle, but Amanda's instincts were sharp. I decided I needed to dig into Dr. Donovan's background and, more importantly, his victims. Amanda secured me access to the files of the deceased patients. She handed over a USB drive in a manila envelope, her hands darting nervously as she glanced over her shoulder. It's all here, she whispered. If they catch me, I'm finished. The files detailed patients of various ages and conditions. A 70-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery, a 45-year-old father hospitalized for pneumonia, and even a 27-year-old man admitted for appendicitis. All had died suddenly, with seemingly plausible causes ranging from embolisms to sepsis. But the timing was odd. Most deaths occurred between midnight and 3 a.m. during Donovan's solo rounds. That alone wasn't proof, but it certainly wasn't coincidence. And then there was the lack of family outcry. Donovan seemed to target those without vocal advocates, the elderly, loners, and those with no immediate kin. The data pointed to one conclusion. If Donovan was involved, he was choosing his victims with chilling precision. Amanda's resolve impressed me, but I could see the toll it was taking. As we sat in my car outside the hospital, she lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. You don't understand, she said, exhaling. Donovan, people worship him here. He's the golden boy, brilliant, charismatic. He's saved lives, you know? But there's this other side. Go on, I urged. I've seen it in his eyes, she continued, staring blankly into the distance. This detachment. He talks about patients like their projects. Once, after someone died, he just said, "It's better this way," and walked off. No sadness, no regret. I could tell Amanda felt trapped. If she went public without hard proof, her career was over. But if Donovan was killing patients, staying silent would mean more deaths. I assured her I'd do everything in my power to find the truth, and that she'd remain anonymous for now. To get closer to Donovan, I needed a cover. Fortunately, my years of experience had taught me the art of blending in. I posed as a research consultant studying medical protocols and shadowed the hospital's operations. Donovan, ever the professional, greeted me with a firm handshake and a clinical smile. Researcher, huh? Well, you'll find we run a tight ship here, he said. His charm was undeniable, but there was something unnervingly controlled about him. as if every move and word were carefully calculated. Over the next few days, I observed him in action. Donovan was highly efficient, with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Nurses and patients alike admired him, but I noticed a subtle unease in some of his colleagues. They praised him, but it often felt rehearsed, as if admitting anything negative might bring trouble. Then there were his interactions with patients. He was polite but distant, speaking to them as if they were case studies rather than people. It wasn't overtly suspicious, but something about him set my instincts on edge. One night, during his shift, I watched from the shadows as Donovan lingered outside a patient's room, a young woman recovering from a minor respiratory infection. He hesitated, glanced around, and then entered. Minutes later, her monitor emitted a warning beep. Donovan called for a crash cart with practiced calm. The patient survived, but something about the timing gnawed at me. Whatever Donovan was doing, he was good at it. Too good. The hospital was a perfect hunting ground, bustling with activity and prone to natural losses. Donovan's victims seemed like the inevitable casualties of complex medical conditions. But as I dug into the files Amanda had provided, patterns began to crystallize. Each victim was uniquely vulnerable. Elderly patients recovering from minor surgeries, individuals with treatable infections, and a few whose conditions bordered on psychosomatic. All had seemingly straightforward paths to recovery before their sudden deaths. None were under extraordinary circumstances, and yet, under Donovan's care, they all met their end. I constructed a timeline. The deaths weren't random. They were evenly spaced, like clockwork. Donovan's shifts coincided with an uncanny percentage of fatalities. Hospital deaths are rarely questioned unless there's an obvious mistake, and Donovan appeared to exploit this blind spot with chilling precision. I began questioning staff members who worked closely with Donovan. Most were hesitant, some even defensive. "He's brilliant," said one nurse, avoiding my gaze. "I've seen him pull off miracles." "It's not fair to." "Miracles don't explain why patients keep dying during his shifts," I pressed. Another nurse, more candid after some coaxing, admitted that Donovan's demeanor during emergencies was off. "He doesn't panic," she said. "It's like he knows what's going to happen. That's not normal." I spoke with an orderly who recalled an incident that still haunted him. This old guy, stable, just waiting to be discharged, suddenly crashed. I ran in to help, and Donovan just stood there for a second, watching, like he was waiting for something. Then he sprang into action, but it was too late. These testimonies were fragments of a larger, darker mosaic. Donovan's brilliance, his unflappable calm, his godlike persona. Everything pointed to someone who was accustomed to orchestrating life and death. I reached out to the families of Donovan's suspected victims. Most had accepted the official explanations: embolism, sepsis, sudden cardiac arrest. But Sarah Lang's daughter, Claire, had never been convinced. "My mother was fine," she said when we met at her modest suburban home. "She was walking, laughing." Then, 2 hours later, they call me and say she's gone. Claire described Donovan as both charming and unsettling. "He said all the right things. We did everything we could. Sometimes these things happen. But there was something in his eyes. He wasn't sad. He was satisfied." Her words resonated deeply. I'd seen that satisfaction before, in criminals who felt untouchable. Claire handed me her mother's medical records, hoping they might help. "Please," she begged, "don't let him get away with this." The key to cracking the case would lie in hard evidence, not speculation. I pored over Sarah Lang's autopsy report. It read like a textbook case of a pulmonary embolism, unexpected, but plausible. Yet something felt off. I reached out to Dr. Megan Hall, a trusted forensic pathologist with a knack for spotting the unseeable. After hours of scrutiny, she called me with a chilling discovery. "There's potassium chloride in her blood," she said. "Small amounts, but enough to trigger cardiac arrest." Potassium chloride was a perfect weapon. It's naturally occurring in the body, and in small doses, it could induce a fatal heart rhythm without leaving an obvious trace. Only someone with medical expertise could wield it so effectively. This was the first concrete proof that Sarah Lang's death wasn't natural. But one anomaly wouldn't be enough to build a case against Donovan. I needed more. Armed with the knowledge of potassium chloride, I turned my attention to hospital inventory logs. Hospitals are meticulous about tracking controlled substances, but even the best systems have weak spots. I enlisted Amanda's help in accessing the records discreetly. After hours of cross-referencing, we found a pattern. Tiny discrepancies appeared on nights when Donovan was on duty, small enough to avoid detection but consistent enough to establish a link. Potassium chloride vials went missing, but only when Donovan was present. "This is it," Amanda whispered, her voice shaking. "This is how he's doing it." It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was the thread I needed to pull. Now that I had a working theory, it was time to build a watertight case. I mapped out every suspicious death, cross-referenced them with Donovan's shifts, and compiled a list of patients who survived narrowly under his care. The patterns were undeniable, but I needed more. Something tangible. Something that would hold up in court. I secured the hospital's full inventory logs and matched them to patient charts. The discrepancies lined up perfectly with Donovan's shifts. On 3 separate occasions, potassium chloride was logged out for emergency use, but never administered or accounted for in patient records. Donovan was meticulous, but even the best plans have cracks. These missing vials were a smoking gun in the making. Hope came in the form of Harold Beckett, a spry 80-year-old who had narrowly survived a cardiac episode under Donovan's care. When I visited him, he recounted the night with remarkable clarity. "I felt a burning in my chest, like fire. Just before I blacked out," he said. "Next thing I know, a nurse is yelling and I'm back." Harold's description matched the effects of potassium chloride. He was alive because a vigilant nurse had intervened before the substance could fully take effect. His testimony would be crucial. To catch Donovan in the act, I needed eyes inside. I coordinated with Amanda and a few trusted staff members to monitor his shifts. A hidden camera was installed in the supply room, and nurses kept a close watch on patient monitors. The waiting was agonizing. Donovan was cautious, but predators inevitably slip when they feel invincible. The breakthrough came late one night. Donovan entered a patient's room, a young woman with mild asthma, and moments later, her monitor spiked. A nurse rushed in and found an empty vial near her bedside. The patient survived, but the evidence was damning. The time had come to confront Dr. Donovan. The confrontation was calculated and deliberate. I knew Donovan's composure wouldn't crack easily, but his meticulous nature could be his undoing. With the evidence in hand, potassium chloride discrepancies, survivor testimony, and the suspicious vial found near the asthma patient, I coordinated with law enforcement to confront him during his next shift. It was a quiet evening when officers and I entered the hospital. Donovan was in his office, reviewing charts with his usual unflappable calm. He glanced up as we entered, his piercing eyes betraying no emotion. "Dr. Alec Donovan," I said, stepping forward, "you're under investigation for the suspicious deaths of multiple patients." He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Suspicious deaths?" he repeated, his voice calm. "You'll have to be more specific. I deal with death every day." Specifics? I laid out the evidence with surgical precision. The missing vials, the timeline of deaths, and the survivor's testimony. His mask of control began to slip. "This is absurd," he snapped, rising to his feet. "Hospitals are chaotic environments. People die. I save lives every day." "You didn't save them," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "You chose them. You played God." The room fell silent. Donovan's hands clenched, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps? But before he could respond, the officers stepped forward and cuffed him. As they led him out, he turned to me, his face unreadable. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, almost as if he believed it. In the interrogation room, Donovan initially maintained his air of superiority. He denied everything, accusing the hospital of incompetence and the investigation of being a witch hunt. But the evidence was overwhelming. When confronted with the potassium chloride findings, he leaned back, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Do you know how many people die unnecessarily every year?" he said, his tone clinical. "Do you know how much suffering goes unchecked because doctors are too afraid to act? Are you admitting to acting?" I pressed. Donovan hesitated, then sighed. "Sometimes, Intervention is mercy, not murder. His words were chilling. For him, this wasn't about justice or ethics. It was about control. He believed he had the right to decide who lived and who died. Donovan's facade began to crumble as the interrogation wore on. He admitted to administering lethal doses of potassium chloride to patients he deemed beyond saving. They were suffering, he said, his voice taking on a hollow quality. Their families couldn't see it, but I could. I ended their pain. I pushed harder. What about the patients who weren't suffering? Sarah Lang? Harold Beckett? His jaw tightened. Mistakes happen, he muttered, looking away. Mistakes? I repeated, incredulous. You mean miscalculations? This wasn't mercy. It was experimentation. For the first time, Donovan looked shaken. You don't understand, he said quietly. None of you do. Medicine is imperfect. Sometimes the only way forward is to decide. The confession sent shockwaves through the hospital. Staff members were horrified, struggling to reconcile the brilliant, life-saving doctor they had admired with the cold-blooded killer they now knew him to be. Amanda Rivers became a hero in the eyes of many, but the guilt of not speaking up sooner weighed heavily on her. I should have noticed earlier, she told me during one of our conversations. I trusted him. We all did. The families of Donovan's victims demanded answers. Lawsuits flooded in, targeting both the hospital and its administrators for failing to notice the pattern sooner. The media frenzy turned the hospital into a symbol of medical betrayal, forcing its board to overhaul protocols and hire an external review team. The trial was a spectacle. Donovan's defense team painted him as a misunderstood genius, a man driven by compassion who had crossed ethical lines for the greater good. They leaned heavily on his spotless record, his accolades, and his undeniable skill as a doctor. But the prosecution tore that narrative apart. They brought in experts to explain how potassium chloride was used to mimic natural deaths. They presented testimonies from survivors, grieving families, and Amanda Rivers. And they showed the jury the cold, calculated patterns Donovan had followed. Donovan himself took the stand, delivering a chilling defense. I did what others couldn't, he said. I made the hard choices, and I'd do it again. The courtroom fell silent. His lack of remorse was palpable. After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and sorrow. The judge's words were damning. Dr. Donovan, you violated the most sacred oath of your profession. You exploited the trust of patients, families, and colleagues, and you inflicted immeasurable pain. For these acts, you will spend the rest of your life behind bars. Donovan showed no emotion as he was led away. But for the families in the gallery, his punishment was a small step toward closure. The families of Donovan's victims struggled to move on. Sarah Lang's daughter, Claire, became an outspoken advocate for hospital oversight, lobbying for stricter protocols and better training for staff to recognize warning signs. The hospital itself underwent a complete overhaul. New administrators implemented rigorous checks on medication logs and introduced mandatory ethical training for all staff. But the shadow of Donovan's actions lingered, a stark reminder of how trust can be weaponized. As I pieced together the final report, I couldn't help but reflect on what had driven Donovan to such depths. Was it a God complex, or had he truly believed he was helping? The truth likely lay somewhere in between. A dangerous blend of arrogance and detachment, amplified by the high-stakes world of medicine. This case haunted me more than most. Donovan wasn't a typical killer. He had no malice, no greed. Instead, he wielded his intellect like a scalpel, cutting away at the lines that separate right from wrong. This case taught me a harsh lesson. Evil doesn't always come in obvious forms. It can wear a white coat, speak with authority, and project an image of compassion. But behind that facade, it can be just as destructive as any other kind of darkness. It also reinforced the importance of listening to whistleblowers like Amanda. Without her courage, Donovan might still be practicing, his victims quietly vanishing without anyone noticing. As I drove away from the hospital for the last time, I saw Amanda standing by the entrance. She waved, a faint smile on her face. Her bravery had saved lives, and though she would carry the burden of this case forever, She had also ensured that justice was served. The case of Dr. Alec Donovan was closed, but its echoes would remain. For me, it was another reminder of why I do what I do, to uncover the truth, no matter how well it's hidden, and to bring light to the darkest corners of human nature. If you like this story and want to watch more stories by Detective Lefebre, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment below. Remember, the truth is in details.